We all love a dust-up between the good guys, don't we? So, a limited series devoted to a super-powered scrap between the Avengers featuring Thor, She-Hulk and Captain America, and Chris Claremont's X-Men? Count me in, true believer. The Avengers debuted in September of 1963 as essentially Marvel's version of the Justice League of America. That is, a group of pre-existing characters that the buying public would love to see teaming up. The X-Men debuted in... no way. The fact that the Avengers and the X-Men debuted in the same month of the same year isn't quite as mind-bogglingly coincidental as it first seems. The company who at that time distributed Marvel's comics, Independent News, had limited Marvel to 11 titles per month. Now, with rising profits thanks to the Marvel books, they allowed an increase of 3 titles. Stan the Man was told to come up with 2 new bi-monthly superhero books, and the 2 teams were his solution. Unlike the Avengers, the X-Men were created fresh from the ground up and included no established characters. The X-Men themselves, Professor X, the Danger Room, the School for Gifted Youngsters, Magneto, all of them were making their very first appearance. Of course, both teams went on to have successful series and numerous spin-offs that continue to the present day, although the future of the X-Men was in doubt for a few years, until the team was redesigned and relaunched as the all-new, all-different X-Men by writer-editor Len Wein and penciler Dave Cockrum. The Avengers clashed with the original X-Men back in 1968, but after the Age of the Limited series was launched with 1982's Contest of Champions, and 24 years after both teams made their debut, the spotlight was squarely focused on the battle that all fans wanted to see. This cover and the interior pencils are by Mark Silvestri. He joined Marvel in the 1980s after working on a few, and I mean a few, DC comics. After this series, he went on to be the regular artist on the Uncanny X-Men, and then on the Wolverine solo book. He left Marvel in 1992 to be one of the founders of Image Comics, releasing his own titles under the Top Cow imprint. Our writer is Roger Stern. He worked on lots of titles for both of the big two, building up respectable runs on the likes of The Incredible Hulk, Doctor Strange, various Superman titles, The Amazing Spider-Man, most notably creating The Hobgoblin, and The Avengers. And he was the Avengers' regular writer when this series came out in 1987. Before we begin, you should bear in mind that at this point, Magneto is a reformed character. No longer intent on proving the superiority of mutants over non-mutants at any cost, he has chosen to follow the path of Charles Xavier and help to forge a world where mutants and humans can live together in harmony. He is now very much an ally of the X-Men and has been headmaster of the School for Gifted Youngsters for over a year now. With that in place, let's begin. I've commented before on how the colouring techniques changed in the 1980s. The decade started off with quite soft colours in the comics, and as new techniques were introduced, suddenly the colours became really quite harsh, quite stark. This came out in 1987, and clearly they've already mastered or improved the techniques, the methods, because although the colours in this comic are really strong and bold, they aren't quite so jarring as those the first wave of new colours were. And a shout out on that subject to Christy Shield. She was the colourist for this series, and whenever comics are reprinted in, say, trade paperback form, they are invariably recoloured. They aren't re-inked or repenciled or rewritten, but they do always tend to be recoloured. So the work of the colourist is very ephemeral in that sense. So Christy Shield, she did the work on this series, and she did a brilliant job. A meteor shower is heading for a heavily populated area in Ohio, and the Avengers are on hand to try to clear out all the people to minimise the casualties. And I love not only the security guards' reaction to seeing Captain America, what, but also Captain America's reaction to the security guard. Cap and Dr. Druid are physically on the ground, trying to clear out as many shoppers from a shopping mall as they can. And in the skies above Earth, we have Captain Marvel and Thor trying to destroy as many fragments from the meteor shower as they can. And again, on the subject of colours, look at this. In one panel, there are half a dozen shades of yellow and orange, and it just looks gorgeous. Thor had had a tough year or two leading up to this event. First of all, in issue 362 of his own comic, Hela inflicted serious facial injuries on him, and as a result he grew a beard to hide the scarring. Then about a year after that, she placed a curse on him that made his bones brittle, and after he was left broken and battered from a battle with the Dark Elves, he started wearing a fully protective suit of armour. The result of all this? Thor looks really cool. The final two members of the team, the Black Knight and She-Hulk, are in a Quinjet, trying to do what they can to help destroy the meteor chunks with the Quinjet's pulse blaster. The Avengers... Damn, Thor. The Avengers avert the crisis, although studying a lump of meteor that did make it to Earth, they discover that it is strangely magnetic. There's a chap there from the National Security Council, and he, studying the rock, finds something that amuses him, and he says he can't wait to tell the Russians. Speaking of Russia, we head to that country now, where the Soviet super soldiers are dealing with a runaway train. If you're unfamiliar with the Soviet super soldiers, they consist of Vanguard, with his ability to repel energy. He always seemed quite cool, although not much fun at parties. You've got the Titanium Man, you've got the Man-Bear known as Ursa Major, and you've got Dark Star, someone whose ability to use dark force always provides opportunities for striking artwork. They are joined on this occasion by the Crimson Dynamo, someone who they instantly distrust because he is a KGB agent. He says, put that to one side because we are all on the same side, we are all here for the good of our country. And this incident with the runaway train was caused by the rail yard's computer systems being disrupted by a meteor passing through Russian airspace. And he believes that the source of that meteor could provide them with an opportunity to correct a grave wrong that was done against their country. Clearly, the Soviet super soldiers are intrigued. Elsewhere, the X-Men are enjoying some downtime. Let's join them. There's Storm, Dazzler, Magneto at this point, Rogue and Wolverine, who, let's be honest, rather impressively cuts a fly in half. Alex Summers, Havoc, is also there, but he's walking nearby, lost in his own thoughts, because he has literally just rejoined the team back in the main title, and he is really struggling to come to terms with the fact that Magneto, once the X-Men's sworn enemy, is now one of them. I've always thought he's had some of the coolest looking powers, and that, thanks to the artwork and the colours in this issue, has never been more true. They have a portable TV playing for company, and on that TV there was a news report about the Avengers' work in Ohio in averting that crisis. But it also mentions the fact that another fragment of the meteor, displaying strange electromagnetic properties, is believed to have landed in Southeast Asia, something which Magneto is clearly very interested to hear. He then trots back to the Blackbird, where he uses the computer systems to work out roughly where this meteor has landed in Southeast Asia, and he changes and he leaves without telling the X-Men anything. But that doesn't mean to say that he wasn't seen. Wolverine calls the rest of the team back to the Blackbird. Having checked the ship's computers, he can confirm that this asteroid has landed in what they call in this comic Kampuchea. We generally tend to call it Cambodia. And it looks like it's part of Asteroid M, which used to be Magneto's base. He doesn't trust Magneto's motives for going to track that piece of meteor down, and he thinks that maybe there is some technology there from Magneto's past that Magneto wants. And he thinks the X-Men should go and check it out, just to make sure that there's no skullduggery going on. Oh, and in case you're wondering, that is how you look cool when putting on your superhero mask. Thanks to that chap from the National Security Council, the Avengers now also know about the link to Asteroid M. The National Security Council told the CIA, they told the KGB, and the KGB are happy to have Magneto terminated. And all of those agencies are happy to kind of work together to use that fragment of meteor in Kampuchea as bait to draw Magneto out. Thor points out that regardless of Magneto's crimes, that is not the way to deal with him. Dr. Druid knows nothing about Magneto, and that gives the rest of the team the excuse to fill him in and us in on a potted history of Magneto. From his very first run-in with the X-Men in X-Men issue 1, right up to the incident that is the real crux of this whole series, and that happened in X-Men issue 150. In that issue, Magneto was holding Cyclops and his then girlfriend hostage on his hidden island base in the Bermuda Triangle. Don't laugh. That hidden base had a special kind of force field that negated other people's mutant powers. So this is one of those rare occasions where we can actually see Scott Summers' eyes. Magneto issues an ultimatum to all the world's nuclear powers. They have 1 week in which to disarm, otherwise he will destroy them. Basically, he doesn't care if they wipe each other out with their nuclear weapons, but he doesn't want any mutants to be harmed in doing so. So this is the only way to make the world safe for mutant kind. The Soviet Union sent one of their submarines to fire missiles upon Magneto's not so well hidden base. And after dealing with the torpedoes, he then sank the entire submarine with all hands on board. He then created a volcano in Varakino, Siberia, which I don't think is a real place. And he says if there's any more resistance, the next volcano will be created in the heart of Moscow. Naturally, by the end of the issue, the X-Men had thwarted his plans and destroyed his base, although Magneto himself managed to escape. And of course, because of that force field around Magneto's island base, a lot of what the X-Men did there was achieved without their powers. It's a really good issue, check it out. Now, Magneto did stand trial for the deaths of the submarine crew and his various other crimes against humanity, and that is referred to by the Avengers here. And they say that he skipped out on his trial. That all happened in X-Men issue 200. The trial took place in Paris, and whilst it was running, there were various dangerous incidents going off around the city that were designed to make it look as though the X-Men were responsible for them, to stoke up anti-mutant sentiment. It turned out that the people behind that were a pair of superpowered twins called Fenris, and they were children of one of Magneto's old adversaries and former Hydra bigwig, Baron von Strucker. The twins ended up attacking the court building, but after being defeated, left it too unsound for the case to continue. It did seem that Magneto was winning the courtroom over, but then, before a verdict was reached, there was the attack by Fenris. Magneto saved Professor X's life, promised to be a better man in the future, and then just never returned to the trial. It's another really good issue, with lots of moral and political points and plenty of good quality action, including a fastball special. So the Soviets think that Magneto got off too easily. But, more importantly, so did Roger Stern, and that was his motivation for writing this entire series. He thought it wasn't right that having killed hundreds of people on that submarine, Magneto effectively got off scot-free. Although She-Hulk says they should just leave Magneto to the Soviets, Captains Marvel and America disagree. They say that everyone deserves a fair trial, and they resolve to bring Magneto in on behalf of the United Nations. The man himself has nearly tracked down that meteor fragment in Kampuchea, but Captain Marvel, who of course moves at the speed of light, has tracked him down. She says that he is under arrest, and as her colleagues arrive to help her out, his colleagues arrive to help him out. As Wolverine says, if you got a problem with Magneto, you got a problem with us. And do you want another good Wolverine pick? Go on then. Yeah, baby. Then, as tensions begin to rise between the two teams, a third team enters the fray as the Soviet super soldiers arrive. They want to take him to Russia to face justice. In one panel alone, things escalate rapidly, and then Crimson Dynamo gets the last words as he says, "Justice for the people, death to Magneto. Entertainment for us. So far, so very good. Can the standard be maintained in issue 2? Well, does that answer your question? Although it's really just the Avengers versus the Soviet super soldiers, as Captain Marvel orders them to attack to stop them from taking Magneto. Whilst everyone is distracted by the battle, Rogue grabs Magneto and the X-Men make good their escape. Thor is battling the Titanium Man, but only overcomes him with the help of Captain Marvel, something which he isn't happy about, as he says there is no glory in this victory, and basically it's better to have died. What a mood hoover. Dr. Druid is doing really well, as he convinces Darkstar that Vanguard and Ursa Major are actually She-Hulk and the Black Knight, and so she traps them in her bonds of Dark Force. Meanwhile, the X-Men want to leave, all except Magneto, of course, who insists he must go and find that fragment of Asteroid M. He says there's technology in it that is too dangerous to fall into the wrong hands. He then leaves to find it alone, and the Avengers, having dealt with the Soviet super soldiers, head out to recapture him. The X-Men do decide to go after him in the Blackbird, and Captain Marvel eavesdrops on them. That gives us an excuse to look at this great piece of artwork from Mark Silvestri. Having found the asteroid fragment, Magneto gets what he came for, his old helmet. And having recovered it, he sets the rest of the asteroid to self-destruct. But he isn't alone. And after Thor randomly throws his hammer at the asteroid, Magneto tries to repel the whole team with fragments of rock. Thor and She-Hulk's physical attacks are ineffective, but then Captain Marvel does something to him. Whatever it is, it knocks him out for the next few pages, which means he misses the arrival of his teammates. We have Havoc being awesome. We have Indestructible Blade going up against Indestructible Blade as Wolverine faces off against the Black Knight. And we have Rogue versus She-Hulk. That's what we want. Magneto recovers from whatever it was that Captain Marvel did to him in time to warn everybody that the asteroid was about to explode. Captain Marvel, moving at the speed of light, tries to track down the device before it detonates, but it's too late, and there's a massive explosion that would have killed them all, if it weren't for Magneto. Having saved everybody by setting up a protective force field, Magneto gathers up the X-Men, gets into the Blackbird, and they leave. The Avengers too gather themselves together, and then Dane Whitman, the Black Knight, notices that Dr. Druid is nowhere to be seen. In the Blackbird, you can cut the atmosphere with a knife. Magneto is staying stumm, the rest of the X-Men have grave concerns about him, and there, sitting in one of the seats, as cool as a cucumber, is Dr. Druid, and he's using his psychic powers to shield his presence from the others. I've never really been a Dr. Druid fan, but I tell you what, he's winning me over. The cover to issue 3 is outstanding. Captain America looks great as he tries to pull the Titanium Man off of Wolverine, who he is both trying to strangle and drown at the same time. Inside, Darkstar is finally brought out of her trance and releases her comrades. Vanguard is furious with the Avengers, and this gives the Crimson Dynamo an excuse to also vent his anger with the Avengers, because they helped the X-Men spirit Magneto away. But he takes it a little bit too far, because he then goes on to call the Avengers mutant lovers, and Darkstar is quick to remind him that the Soviet super soldiers themselves are mutants. He then blusters something about that's not what he meant. He meant that there are just some outlaw mutants that give all mutants a bad name. On the Blackbird, Magneto still isn't letting on to the rest of the X-Men why it is that he was so desperate to get his old helmet back. We know because we can see his thoughts, and we know that there are microchips within the helmet that he thinks he can use to perform what he calls miracles. Shortly after that, Dr. Druid is finally discovered by Magneto, and the X-Men deal with him. The first stage of dealing with him is for him to be sent to sleep by a kiss on the forehead from Rogue. Then the Avengers get a call on the radio of their Quinjet from Dr. Druid, who informs them that he's in Singapore, not that he remembers how he got there. Captain Marvel, always the first on the scene, flies to Singapore to meet up with Dr. Druid. She radios the Avengers Quinjet to report that he's okay, but that transmission is picked up by the Crimson Dynamo and the Titanium Man, and so they set course for Singapore. Before you know it, all of the Avengers and all of the Soviet super soldiers are in Singapore, and they're all on the lookout for Magneto. They do it in various ways, whether it be by rickshaw, by motorbike, or by the Black Knight's electronic steed. And look at that, Thor striking the pose of a man who knows he looks good. The Soviets are dressed down in the hope that they will mingle more freely with the tourists, and Vanguard thinks that he's spotted someone who could be Havoc. Before he's able to confirm that suspicion, Wolverine finds him and tries to attack him, not that it gets him very far. It's then down to Rogue, playing damsel in distress, to use her powers to knock him out. But he doesn't completely lose consciousness, and he overhears them talking about needing to meet up with a Dutch freighter as they run off. Later on in the freighter, we're given a few more details about Magneto's plans for that helmet. He plans to use it to wipe all prejudice from the minds of all people, particularly anti-mutant prejudice. Then, as he's talking to Storm about the fact that he doesn't want the X-Men to place themselves in jeopardy on his behalf any longer, they are alerted to the fact that the Soviets have found them. The Crimson Dynamo is quick to try to take control of the situation, but Wolverine doesn't appreciate that. But the Crimson Dynamo doesn't appreciate Wolverine. Then it's action time again, folks. As Havoc takes on the Crimson Dynamo, Dazzler faces off against Dark Star, and Vanguard doesn't allow Rogue a second chance to knock him out. With all this chaos on board, the captain sends out a distress signal. The Crimson Dynamo is tearing the place apart, desperately trying to find Magneto, and the Titanium Man has to remind him that there are innocent civilians on board. In response to that, the Crimson Dynamo again reveals his more hardline approach, as he says no one who shelters Magneto is innocent. And just to underline his determination, he blasts a hole in the hull of the ship to ensure it goes nowhere until Magneto is found. Now, although by this point Wolverine has tangled with the Titanium Man, they don't end up in the water, as per the cover. But now, in response to the distress call, Captain America and the rest of the Avengers do arrive. And although Vanguard pits his hammer against Thor's hammer, guess who wins that one? The Avengers aren't there to fight, they're there for a rescue mission. Thor points out to Vanguard that the ship was sinking before the Avengers arrived. And Vanguard says, well, it wasn't us, we wouldn't do that. But Thor points out that the X-Men definitely wouldn't, because they're relying on that freighter to escape from Singapore. And I've got to say, at this point in the discussion, in Vanguard's position, I'd be crapping my pants right now. All three teams now work together to save every crew member from that now seriously listing ship. And at the end, there are only two people missing, Magneto and the Crimson Dynamo. And that prompts the Gremlin, who is the man inside the Titanium Man's suit, to point out that the Dynamo had power enough to survive the explosion, or even to cause it. Before long, the Crimson Dynamo does reappear, emerging from beneath the waves. And after some brief questioning by his teammates, he admits that he was behind the sinking of the freighter. They are furious, because they point out that were it not for the efforts of the Avengers and the X-Men, more civilian lives could have been lost on the freighter, just like all the civilian lives that were lost on the submarine that Magneto sank. After Captain Marvel makes clear the irony of the situation to the Crimson Dynamo, the Soviet super soldiers say they will turn the Dynamo over to the authorities in Singapore, and they say they will allow the Avengers and the X-Men to deal with Magneto in whatever way they feel is correct. Watching all of this unfold from the safe distance of another ship is Magneto. And he's talking to a crew member there, and the crew member says, oh, so do you have business in Singapore, which is where this ship is now headed to? And Magneto says yes, he has unfinished business. Unfinished business. Now ain't that ironic? People, we have a problem. It was Roger Stern's intention to use this series to return Magneto to full villain status. Editorial disagreed. No one outside of Marvel knows who exactly Editorial was, and even Roger Stern hasn't shed any light on their identity in the years since. There are prime suspects. Some say Editor-in-Chief Jim Shooter, and he did end up helping to write the final issue. But it is said that by 1987 he was more involved with the business side of Marvel and didn't take as much interest in storylines. The editors of the series then, Mark Grunwald and Ann Nocenti, they certainly fit the description of editorial, but surely they knew the direction of the storyline from the very outset, and it seems odd that they should take issue with it with just one, issue left. One more possibility would be Chris Claremont. Magneto was a key character in the Uncanny X-Men at this point, and such a significant change to him would have had seismic repercussions on that book. Maybe Claremont took his concerns to editorial, and editorial decided that disruption to a limited series is much more preferable to disruption to one of their top titles. Whoever was behind the veto of Magneto's heel turn, Roger Stern wasn't playing along with it, and he decided to leave the series rather than write an ending that he didn't want. Jim Shooter and Tom DeFalco came on board to co-write the last issue in this series. Tom, by the way, being the only person mentioned by Roger Stern in relation to this storyline, and that was to confirm that he wasn't the mystery man behind the veto. There was another big change for this issue. You may have already spotted that this cover is not the work of Mark Silvestri, and that is because he followed Roger Stern out the door, albeit for very different reasons. You remember I said that he went on to pencil the Uncanny X-Men? Well, that change happened during this series. The offer came his way as he finished issue 3, and he decided to go there and then. Maybe if Roger Stern hadn't left, he would have stayed on, so the pair of them could have completed what they'd started. As it is, Keith Pollard came on board to provide breakdowns for Joseph Rubinstein to finish. New writers, new artists, and a new ending. Did all of this affect the flow of the story? We are talking a complete gear shift. We're all now back in Singapore, and the Avengers have burst into the office of Mr. Ronalds, who's the guy that's in charge of the unit looking into Magneto's crimes, and they demand to know from him what's happened to the X-Men and the Soviet super soldiers. The X-Men are being held in protective custody, probably because they saved all those innocent lives. It makes sense. As for the Soviet super soldiers, they have returned to Russia. That's it. You won't see them again at all in this series. Mr. Ronald's unit have actually had a tip-off about the location of Magneto, but they aren't sharing that with the Avengers. Instead, their team try and fail to apprehend him. Part of the reason that he was able to evade capture was because he was aided by some Singaporean mutants. They now take him to a place called the Galleria, which is where lots of mutants from that area gather, and they treat him as though he is some kind of mutant messiah. They and their leader want war against humankind, but Magneto explains that he has now turned his back on that path in life. Whilst he is there, the army, presumably the Singaporean army, discovers them and starts randomly shooting at them because they're mutants and everyone hates and fears mutants. Magneto knocks all the soldiers unconscious with a wave of magnetic force. It never ceases to amaze me the extent of Magneto's apparently magnetic-based powers. He can create volcanoes, he can knock people unconscious. You'd think it would just stretch to making forks stick to his forehead. The X-Men have grown tired of sitting around in an armoured truck, so decide to escape. That's the end of that subplot. Wolverine quickly picks up on Magneto's scent, but then the X-Men find their way blocked by the Avengers. I don't know how the Avengers knew that the X-Men were running down the alleyway. Do you? The standoff between the two teams is then interrupted by a message from Magneto, who presumably is communicating with them through the powers of magnetism. Then he whisks away both the X-Men and Captain America on waves of pure magnetic force. Then, in the presence of both Captain America and the X-Men, he finally begins to explain that his magnetic powers, paired with the circuitry in his helmet, give him the ability to completely dominate any and every living mind he chooses. He explains that he is considering using it to wipe out all anti-mutant prejudice from everyone's minds around the world, but he doesn't know whether or not, morally, that's the right thing to do. And it is an interesting moral question. That is why he's brought Captain America there, because he says he's probably the most honourable man on the entire planet, and he wants to know what his opinion is on whether or not he should use the helmet. As you would expect, Captain America says that he believes people should be free to make up their own mind, even if it means that that person chooses to be a bigot. And he says that Magneto should destroy the helmet before it's too late and it falls into the wrong hands. Magneto says he will use the helmet on Captain America to wipe out all of his anti-mutant prejudice. After Cap recovers from that magnetic blow, he reiterates the fact that he still believes what he said before, and for exactly the same reasons. And this stuns Magneto, because it shows him that Captain America wasn't prejudiced against mutants. And so maybe he's wrong, because he's always thought that every human was prejudiced against mutants. He thought Captain America was prejudiced against mutants. A man who, the page before, he said was probably the most honourable man on the entire planet. Yeah, he's the most honourable man on the entire planet. He's a bit racist, but other than that, top bloke. Magneto feels shamed. He pulls the circuitry out of the helmet and says that he will surrender to the Avengers. We then skip forward to Magneto's new trial. It's back in Paris, the site of his original trial in X-Men issue 200, and all of the Avengers and X-Men are there. Well, actually, not all of the X-Men. 2 of them are watching on a news report back home in Westchester. It's Psylocke and Longshot. I don't really know why they're there. They're only there for 2 panels, but it's great to see them. From here on in, the comic book is dominated by Magneto's trial. God help us. We see his defence counsel argue that as Magneto sees himself as the uniformed armed force of mutant kind, and therefore he should be accorded the same rights as armies of any kind of equivalent state, his people, mutant kind I guess, haven't signed the Geneva Convention, therefore it doesn't apply to them, by extension to him, and therefore the court has no jurisdiction over him. And that is an argument that the judge is quick to deny. Various witnesses are then called to the witness box, such as a Russian admiral to recount the events of the sunken submarine. And Captain America is also called as a witness. And he's asked if he believes that Magneto is reformed the way that Magneto has claimed he is. To which Captain America says no, he doesn't believe he has reformed, although Magneto himself may think he has. This prompts Magneto to think that the trial is a farce, but then he also thinks that he has vowed to accept the verdicts of the court. Vowed to accept the verdicts of the court? But I thought his argument was the court had no jurisdiction over him. That doesn't make any sense. Do you know what? Not much from here on in does make sense. At one point he realises, without any evidence at all, that the judge is a mutant himself, and he wants to make a martyr of Magneto. But after Captain Marvel is able to invisibly eavesdrop on the judge, she's able to confirm to Magneto that no, he isn't a mutant at all, he is human. Therefore, Magneto resolves to kind of possess his helmet that's all the way over, still in Singapore, and bring it across the oceans to Paris. Once in possession of it, he uses it to wipe the judge's mind of his anti-mutant prejudice. Not that we've had any evidence of that either. Magneto then destroys the helmet to remove the temptation for him to use it on anybody else ever again. And then we move to the judge's verdict. The judge says that only states can declare war, therefore Magneto should be afforded the same rights as a state. That makes sense. He then says that as Magneto has never signed the Geneva Convention, it's the opinion of this court that it has no jurisdiction over him. Hold on. Isn't that exactly the defence argument for Magneto back on page 18? That the judge denied throughout? This is doing my head in. Magneto notices that nobody in the court seems particularly shocked by the verdict. So he's now wondering if this was the verdict that was going to be reached all along, and that him wiping the presumed prejudice from the judge's mind made any difference at all. He and we will never know. So much about that final issue doesn't make sense, and not because of what came before it. It created its own contradictions. Magneto refusing to acknowledge the authority of the court, whilst also pledging to abide by its ruling, stating that Captain America was probably the most honourable man in the world, whilst simultaneously assuming that he was prejudiced, and the grand finale, where, despite the court denying the objection that Magneto was not a state and therefore it held no authority over him, saying that Magneto was not a state, so it held no authority over him. I know it was written to a tight deadline because of the personnel changes, but surely with both Jim Shooter and Tom DeFalco plotting it, they could have come up with something a bit neater. Actually, surely they could have got Chris Claremont to rustle up a plot for them. The biggest irony is that Magneto still hasn't been held to account for his crimes, and that was supposed to be the whole motivation behind this series. The first 3 issues were a well-balanced ensemble piece, where everyone got their time in the spotlight. But in this issue, the Black Knight says 8 words. Havoc, who had been dealing with his angst about working with Magneto, says 5. And Dr. Druid says nothing at all. Quite simply, after an impressive first 3 issues, the standard drops dramatically, and we are left with an ending which is pretty boring. Did I say ending? For some reason, 2 years after this, we got a kind of an epilogue in X Factor Annual Number 4. This comic is something of a triple whammy, with its main story being part of the Atlantis Attacks event. There's also a backup story that ties into the X-Men centred event Inferno, and the little tale that we're going to have a look at. The great John Byrne is our artist, with Ralph Macchio our writer. Doom has summoned Magneto to his castle in Latveria, where he reveals that his technicians have rebuilt Magneto's helmet from the fragments that were left behind of it. Now, supposing there were enough fragments to actually do that, how did Doom and his technicians even know where to find them? After all, when Magneto destroyed the helmet, he did it in private. There was no one else there to see him do that. And also, when he summoned the helmet to him in Paris from Singapore, he did that secretly, so nobody even knew he had it. Doom's ways are mysterious. The purpose for rebuilding this helmet is that Doom wants to have a battle of wills with Magneto. He's replicated the circuitry, and they will use it on each other to probe, to seek weaknesses in each other's minds. This really just serves as an excuse to recap both characters' origin stories as they torture each other with their own tragic histories. They both survive the experience, with Doom declaring enough and Magneto saying no more. Magneto again destroys his helmet, and knowing that Doom would use the copied circuitry to try to control people's minds, Magneto says that the pair of them are above controlling people with circuitry and humming machines. Doom agrees and destroys the copied circuitry. So we're back to square one. What was the point of all that, other than, I suppose, filling some pages in an annual? If part 4 of the limited series wasn't enough of a disappointment, then that postscript certainly put the storyline out of its misery. This was the last of a few limited series based around X-Men team-ups during the 1980s. It began with a crossover with, believe it or not, the Teen Titans, and then cycled through the Micronauts, Alpha Flight and the Fantastic Four. That last series actually overlapping this one, as they were both released in 1987. Despite its disappointing ending, I would still say that this series is the best of all those. One last thing. Roger Stern, who refused to compromise his story for this series, was fired as writer of the Avengers later that same year, after he took exception at the editor's plans to replace Captain Marvel as team leader with Captain America. The editor of the Avengers, as with this series, was Mark Grunwald.